CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to a very special edition of our Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Prof Moyo. I'm from the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment. I'm so excited today to be joined by somebody who is very energetic, vibrant. In just 1 week, she has been to 3 cities giving public lectures. I'm talking about none other than Binaifer Nowrojee. She is the president of the Open Society Foundations. Prior to becoming the president of the foundation, she served in many capacities in the foundation, but also served as part of the Human Rights Watch as the legal counsel. Binaifer, welcome to the Conversations.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. 3 cities in 1 week. How are you feeling?
3 cities in South Africa in 3 days to provide presentations on different issues, but it's the end of the first year of my coming into the role of president of Open Society Foundations. And I wanted to mark that occasion now that we have incubated some of our work and we're moving forward with something that actually gives an overarching vision of how we're seeing the world and where it's going. And I chose South Africa deliberately for a number of reasons. The first is George Soros, who is the founder of Open Society Foundations, started his work in the 80s, giving funds to Black South African scholarships for students to study. And so it was very symbolic. It was also the 30 years of our South Africa Foundation, which we are closing in the restructuring. We'll continue to do work on South Africa, but it was also an opportunity to honor all the people, staff and board members who had served in our South Africa Foundation in Cape Town.
Yeah. So I read somewhere that as you were growing up, you were denied access to a Kenyan university, which ended with you studying in the US, which is a blessing in disguise because chances are we wouldn't be having you at this position right now. But also secondly, because your father was probably, seen to be anti-government. And in a way, when I think back to what you have just said, George Soros met Herbert Vilakazi, a South African who was studying in New York at some point, and he then got to be acquainted with him. And in the 70s, Vilakazi invites George Soros to come to South Africa, as you said, and the first grant is made during that time. But everything is based on the concept of opening societies. And as I was reading about you and your upbringing and some of the forces that came against you, I couldn't stop but think that a lot of what you are doing and what's driving you is also informed by your upbringing, which is not that different, of course, from the concept that George Soros tried to drive of opening closed societies. Maybe we could just use this opportunity to just try and link your upbringing to your trip, because I think it's very symbolic in the sense that you chose Africa and South Africa to actually come here and share your vision as the president of the foundation.
Sure. So I'm from Kenya, so different part of the continent. And when I was growing up, I grew up in a very closed society headed by President Daniel Arap Moi. It was a very fearful society. It was a society where any criticism was heavily punished. We had detention without trial. We had torture cells. We had people fearful, people living in fear and silence. And basically, a small group of very courageous lawyers began to start taking cases to court, looking for habeas corpus to get people who had been abducted and detained produced in court to ensure that they were alive and to push for their release. My father was among that group of lawyers who began to break the silence, and then it snowballed on itself. And I think it's a real statement of how open societies, closed societies can move to open societies through the it doesn't take a large number of people to start it, but then it's like a snowball, it grows. And so now today, Kenya has had many openings, a new constitution, and is not the society it was that I grew up in, but it certainly has impacted in how I view the world on two fronts. One is the importance of critical thinking and debate and inquiry and discussion, but it changed my life. Because I was barred entry to the University of Nairobi because of my father, because of my last name.
Yeah.
And many years later, the Vice Chancellor apologized to my father, and he said, "I'm sorry, we couldn't take your daughter, we had instructions." But it left me, after my A-levels, with no prospect of getting a university education. And so my parents then, through the help of some family friends, organized to send me to the United States. So at age 18, with one suitcase, I showed up in the US and I was able to get an education. And I moved from actually doing sciences, and I became a political scientist and then ultimately studied law.
Yeah.
And like you said, these things are silver linings. You don't know where life is going to lead you. And this is where I ended up going and then it shaped my career.
Yeah, and one of the things also is that you grew up surrounded by books, and you end up lecturing at Harvard, and here you are giving 3 lectures. So for those that did not get the opportunity to tune in or attend your lectures, you did one at UCT looking at the state of the world and how the Open Society Foundations is navigating what you called a dangerous world. But you also did one at WPS and CAPSI, where you focused on philanthropy and its role given the current moment. And last night you did one on the future of human rights. So is it possible for us to just spend a few minutes, maybe take each lecture and just pull out what your messages were? Of course, people are going to have an opportunity to read your lectures, to also maybe listen and view some of the recorded material. But sure. I think for purposes of our audience, just to take each lecture and just pull out the main messages, because I think there's a thread really that cuts across all 3.
Sure, and I'll sort of mash them up.
Yeah.
But first of all, what is an open society? I think it's very easy to recognize a closed society, a society that is one that is there's only a single truth from a leader. There isn't space to debate and discuss. Oftentimes, there are people that are one type of people in that society that are privileged and others that are excluded. An open society is the idea that we are all human beings. Whoever we are, wherever we are, we have the same human dignity, the same humanity, and that an open society makes space for all different types of people inside that society to claim it as their own and to be able to access resources, opportunities, government services without regard for the color of their skin or their religion or their disability, etc. So that is what the goal of the organization is to work with organizations, and even full democracies always have something to strive for, because you don't want just a majoritarian society. You want a society that has some space and give and take. The lectures that I was giving this week were really looking at the moment that we find ourselves in this world, the current moment, because we're living in a time of really quite volatile shifts that we haven't seen. And we're not sure where they're taking us. But what we can see is the old world order of the post-Second World War institutions, the United Nations, this idea of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These are shifting, these concepts are shifting. The unipolar world of the United States being the protector of rights and the leader of the world is gone, it's changing. And for better or worse, we're in a situation of volatility. And I feel like the world is in some ways beginning to crack.
Yeah.
The idea of free markets, free speech, democracy, these kinds of concepts which were supposed to lead us to the promised land are all proving not to be the case. What we are seeing are democracies devouring themselves and voting for illiberal leaders, and it's a thin exercise of elections. We are seeing economic prosperity diminishing and inequality widening because the idea of market fundamentalism is not working.
Yeah.
Clearly, markets need to be regulated, and we've hollowed out government over the years through advice from World Bank, IMF, African governments are finding themselves completely paying debt payments instead of services like education or health for their citizens. The economic order we have is actually impoverishing people. So we're in this moment of global systemic interlocking problems that are actually worsening our situation. And you see a retreat from open society principles because younger people cannot see a promising future for themselves. And on the African continent in particular, which has a huge youth bulge, people need to know that they're going to be able to take care of themselves, be able to have prospects in life. And I think all of this we are seeing disappearing. So what is it that we can do to begin to unlock these things? And that's the big challenge for open society foundations.
Yeah. And of course, you said part of the reason why you are here is to share your vision, but also to hear what the constituencies and the people are saying. What have you heard and what are you taking as you leave South Africa on your mission onwards?
Yeah. So I am actually, I gave 3 lectures in 3 universities, and I'm actually always inspired by meeting younger people. I think that despite the very large obstacles they face, including the challenge of climate change and the prospect of a disappearing planet, they have remarkable foresight in thinking about how we shape a world that has got justice and equity at the heart of it. And you see these young people who are basically not happy with the world we're leaving them with and are not going to have a place, not going to inherit much, but yet they're still thinking what they can offer us. So I think that we're seeing that in different places. Across Kenya, we're seeing young people come out and call for changes. We see that in Senegal, we see it in Bangladesh, we see it here. We see younger voices really beginning to chart a new voice of how we, and also they're organizing differently. They're organizing in social media spaces. They're not the kind of your classic political party with somebody at the head. They're more democratic in their organizing powers. And so I see this as a kind of beacon of hope for Africa, which is not to downplay the dangers, because in this volatile situation, we are also seeing African countries tipping towards conflict. Yeah. We're seeing the social contract between state and citizen frayed, but we also see energy. I mean, I think it's, if you imagine the globe as cracking and you look in those cracks, I actually see light coming out, small areas of light. And the question is, how can open society actually begin to support and nurture these spaces of light and opportunity as the world shifts?
Yeah. So maybe let's take a step back so that we can understand where you are going. When you took over last year as the president of the foundation, you were obviously coming in at a time when the world was emerging from COVID-19 and this devastation, but also consistent and persistent challenges like your climate change, world conflicts, among others, inequality, and you mentioned some of these at your lecture the other day. I'm just keen to know how, as you stepped into the position, what your first 90 days looked like. Transitions are always fascinating for me.
Exactly.
And, just keen to hear what really kept you awake the first 90 days.
The first 90 days, I knew that there were 1,000 things I had to do, and that any CEO that comes in, you can end up getting distracted and actually do so many things you don't achieve anything. Yeah. And so I made a commitment to do 2 things in the first year. The first was we had basically seized all our programmatic work, and it was to create a process that was constructive and through dialogue to create a new set of strategies to address a changed world. And so working with our program teams to discuss and debate what is that we wanted to do. And the second issue, because we had just undergone this big restructuring and actually shrunk quite significantly, was to invest in our organizational culture, to think about addressing morale, rebuilding trust. And those were the 2 areas that I focused on. And I think that those things take time, but I'm happy to say we are now, almost all our programmatic work is started and approved. And we are in the process now of continuing to build an organizational culture that is values-based. Yeah. That takes time.
Yeah. And of course, you had been in the organization for 20 years. And normally what happens is either the system accepts you or the system kicks you out. in this case, the system seems to have accepted you. But I'm also keen to want to understand, so you said, so it's 20 years in the organization, but you were the first female president of the organization in 45 years, and the first president from the global majority. But you said also that there are things that as you came in and right now you want to lead a particular vision of philanthropy, a particular vision of global philanthropy. So there are things that you are keeping and there are things that you are making changes. Maybe we can talk about things that you are keeping and things that you are already beginning to change. And you mentioned some of them in the lecture. I would want us to just take some for the audience.
So Open Society has always worked on the basis of what we call local knowledge, that people from an affected community are best placed to make the decisions about how they can solve their challenges. And we have always had offices run, and we hire people drawn from the place with the community and who sit in that place and who work on the issues. Why? Because we feel actually the quality of the work is better and the understanding is deeper. And so we are globally distributed across the world, and we're keeping that. Open Society is one of the few foundations named after its concept, Open Society. We are not the Soros Foundation or the Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation. The principle of Open Society, the heart of it is the idea of critical thinking, discussion, debate, ideas. And inside the organization, we started a new department called the Ideas Workshop. And the Ideas Workshop really tries to bring together writers and thinkers to debate ideas on contested issues that don't have a simple answer, to really say there's no one voice, there's no one single truth, and that the best society is one that discusses and debates to get where it's going. So these were some of the mainstays that we kept. In terms of how we changed and what we were doing, Open Society had never really worked significantly around economic rights issues. It had always focused on civil and political rights. We now see the global economic architecture as a real problem to address democratic participation and human rights. And so a very significant plank of our work is now looking at working with the issues that are blocking, so economic prosperity. So creating new economic models, helping governments that want to get out of energy that is actually damaging the planet into green energy, new ways in which to do things, economists, working with economists that are new thinkers. So this is a new plank of our work. And what it also means is that for the first time, and it's not completely a new thing, but we understand that economic and dealing with regulating markets requires strong government policy. And so one of the things that we are doing is offering ability to assist governments. And we are also looking at how we can help the South African government in terms of how it's looking at economic prosperity, how it's looking at green energy, in ways that if the government actually wants or assistance, we are happy to support. That's a major change for us. And I think the way we're working, we've always worked with short-term, mid-term, and long-term kind of funding, but we are trying to sharpen our work so that it looks at, we work instead of having standing programs, instead we create a set of goals where we want to have impact, and we build the program around the goals rather than having the work built around a program. And so we're pulling together pieces of work that we think we can make a difference in a set time and doing it. The other thing that we've done is we've moved to multi-year grants. We don't think that with a 1-year grant or a 2-year grant, you can make significant changes. And a lot of our grants in the past were multiple 1-year grants for 10 years, 12 years. So how can we give the assurance to an organization, you can get a 5-year grant, a 6-year grant. That way you can lift your head up and you can look to the future. So changing our ways of grant making and speeding up the process, cutting the application so it's simpler, and then also looking at how much we spent on ourselves and cutting that down so that our overheads come down so we can spend more money providing it to partners and grantees.
I want to come back to this, but when you were speaking, I couldn't resist just going to some of the historical moments in George Soros' life. So, at one moment he walks into London School of Economics and Karl Popper is teaching, Open Society and this discontents. And I'm thinking as you are speaking that, most of your interventions are not going to be easily accepted. Just like Karl Popper's book, for quite some time, that book was rejected. And then when it was finally accepted, it becomes one of the most classics of them all. But also that's where George Soros gets this idea of open society, and but it comes with its contradictions. And I'm just keen to hear what you want your tenure to be remembered for, because some of the issues and the interventions that you are pushing for are going to be resisted by others. I mean, as we speak right now, most of the foundations, especially US-based foundations, are looking inwards as opposed to really, in my view, dealing with issues of social justice as the moment requires. But because of compliance issues, they are more focused now on compliance more than they are focused on the field. And you seem to be doing completely the opposite as open society. So I'm keen to hear, this brave vision that you have and what you want to be remembered for.
Let me start with George Soros, because George Soros was influenced. First, he grew up during the Holocaust and had to, and as somebody who was Jewish, his life was in danger. And then in Hungary under communism, he got to the UK and got a scholarship. And that was his first interaction with philanthropy that allowed him to get an education. And then he was exposed to Karl Popper's philosophy of the idea of an open society. And for many years, he worked on the stock market in the private sector, making his own money. And then later in life, decided to start using the funds he had done to really promote the idea of an open society. It was his realization that in the end, money was not enough, that money didn't protect him or his relatives from being discriminated against just on the basis of being Jewish. Yeah. And that idea, the concept of universalism, of the human being, that is what motivated him. And so we come to this work with the idea that whoever we are, wherever we are one peoples, and that we are all deserving to be treated with dignity and to be allowed our potential for growth. It's not a complex thing that we are promoting, but it is about moving power. And that can be controversial with governments or others that seek to hold power, that people who are on the margins of society, excluded, villainized, or criminalized unfairly because of their identity or because of the way that they find themselves, we seek to make sure that they have voice. And we are seeing different types of movements emerging. And I would say when I look at the world today, and I'm seeing now, this is the first time ever in history that women are going to outnumber men getting university degrees. Yeah. Now give these women 10 years and watch the world. Yeah. It will change. Yeah. It can only but change. Yeah. And so I see women as a very important change agent in shifting the world in this next few decades ahead. Yeah. The other thing we are also seeing, and especially because of climate change, the people who are most affected by climate change are some of the poorest communities who are subject to floods, indigenous groups who are living in areas with rainforest. These groups are really organizing themselves. And actually now when you look at the targeted violence against human rights defenders, the largest amount is against women and environmental defenders. So I see you can see that they are becoming a very strong force in the voice for protecting the planet and protecting people.
Yeah, and of course, when I was introducing you, one of the positions that you held was the Vice President for Organizational Transformation. And you recently went through this organizational transformation, and you alluded to some of the changes that happened during that process. But I think if we can just take a moment and reflect on what were some of the opportunities that you grabbed and what were some of the challenges that you encountered. I think in your lecture you did mention that the change is not always what people expect because some people lost grants and et cetera, et cetera. But maybe if we could take the opportunity to just reflect on that journey as somebody who was heavily involved in it.
Sure. So if you work in the private sector, the idea of rethinking and reinventing yourself is constant. Because you are profit motivated. And so you have to constantly change. As a nonprofit, we don't have that imperative. And Open Society over 40 years plus had really not been forced to change. We opened new things, we continued to open new things, and George Soros was working and providing more funds. And so we grew into a very complicated and sprawling organization. And it was intended intended for Open Society to remain. George Soros had always said he would close it, and it was supposed to close in 2010. So it was never built as an organization for perpetuity. It was only after that that George Soros gave a large amount of money to serve as an endowment in perpetuity. That now created the challenge to say, okay, now we're going to be here. Now we need to think longer term.
Yeah.
How can we actually build something that has efficiencies? We have so much uncompensated complexity in our network that it was taking months for a grant to go through. We had programs that were existing for years and years, but nobody was actually assessing, are they still relevant for where we need to be? And you don't want philanthropy to be taking the place of government. The role of philanthropy is to be a catalyst, an innovator, to help spark things, to get new ideas over the hump so that they can and even to try things and fail. But that's the ability of it. It's not to become a kind of permanent standing replacement for the role of the state. And so one of the things that our philanthropy has had to really learn is, how do we get out of areas of work? How can we think about what it, and especially since we're working in fields where we're not going to see racial justice in our lifetime. We're not going to see economic equality, but we need to think about what's our added value and at what point do you want to get out. So I'll give you an example. We've worked on quite controversial issues. One of them is very early on the idea of harm reduction for people using drugs. Instead of criminalizing them, how can you assist them? And some of that could include like providing clean needles or providing methadone for people to manage their addiction. This was very controversial early on. And we went to visit in Kenya some time back, just a few years ago, a grantee that was working around harm reduction. And now the Ministry of Health was working with them, providing methadone. And we were pulling out our grant and closing it. And as I got on the bus to leave, I said, oh, such a shame. You know, we're no longer supporting them. And the colleague I was with said, no, we supported them for 10 years and they don't need us anymore. Now they're working with the Ministry of Health and they're doing what they set up to do. When we started, the whole idea of harm reduction didn't even exist in Kenya.
So I think that's fascinating to hear, because the reason why I posed this question is because I think there are so many other foundations and groups that are probably in your own shoes, but they've never done this transformative journey. And it's useful to hear some of those transformations that you made. But definitely you came under critics.
Sure.
What were some of the criticisms?
So I think that I would say, I mean, in retrospect, and of course hindsight is 2020, it was a very prolonged transformation because it was such a complex setup that was never intended to be a single organization, which is why it's called Open Society Foundations, and had many different separately registered affiliated organizations. It had many multiple operations centers. Nothing was centralized, etc. And George Soros always said, if my organization is centralized, I've failed. It was always the idea of local knowledge being locally based, but we needed to build in efficiencies. I think that it's always a question of whether you go incrementally or whether you go fast, which fields you make a decision to get out of, which ones you make a decision to stay in. But I can tell you, the thing about leadership is you'll never please everybody. If you're pleasing everybody, you really are, then you're not exercising leadership. This is not to downplay at all how difficult it was. And even that people can question the decisions that were made, and perhaps in retrospect we will say, okay, we shouldn't have closed that, or we should have done this differently. But I can say it was a mammoth task, and it was very inward looking, and we had the luxury of being self-absorbed for that. And this is a time in the world where not many have the luxury to be internally facing when the world is on fire. So I think that we are beyond that now. And the idea is now that Open Society is back in the world doing what it's supposed to do, hopefully more efficiently and better.
So for those who are still stuck in the old model, how is the Open Society Foundations configured now and for the future?
So Open Society Foundations used to have standing programs that went for many, many years, and they received a standing budget. And so you could count on your standing budget, and you would ask for more money if you wanted more, but ultimately every year you would be guaranteed you would get your standing budget, regardless of what you were doing. And there were strategy plans handed in. But now what we're saying is the world is shifting so fast, we need to be able to pivot. And so we need to also at the outset define where it is we can make a difference. Because there's a lot of times you can be providing funds to groups or being part of something, but the question is, are you impacting? And this is a very difficult thing to measure in social justice. And so unlike, again, a corporation that can measure how many bottles of soda it sold or what, we don't have the luxury of that. The wins are small, and the wins are also difficult to measure. And sometimes you stop something from happening, but you never know. And so even measuring success is a hard metric. So let's start with a set of goals that we think we can achieve. And then let's also have the ability to have long-term faith in organizations and partners for things that we know are not going to come quickly, and have that patient capital that's going to be there, and we'll support for 10, 20 years. And then let's have rapid response funds so that if something unexpected happens, we can move.
Yeah. So, I mean, as we get closer to the end, I mean, at your lecture at Wits and CAPSI, your lecture came at the right time, given the current global context, which is characterized by the decline on aid. But I think, as you put it, it's actually withdrawal of aid, and it may never come back. What are your final thoughts on the future of philanthropy, in particular African philanthropy and African agency as you see it?
So I think we're also moving into a different space as well. I think the retreat of the United States from playing a role in philanthropy or in foreign aid, and the cuts by USAID, I think were quite a jolt because they were undertaken without much notice, and have left people in the lurch, people who really need HIV medication or refugees in or wartime humanitarian aid. But I think what it also signals is, 40, 50, 60 years after African independence, what is it that African governments need to be asking themselves about their role, and how can they think carefully about how they fill this gap? As opposed to, again, let's not be rosy-eyed. The aid, aid and assistance that's given this way also creates its own dependencies. It also creates its own pathologies that are not healthy. And so we also have to think carefully about how we want to make people self-sufficient, and also without undermining the role of government and citizens to help themselves. Now, across Africa, I think, yes, Africa lost a lot of this USAID funds, but honestly, Africans are very entrepreneurial. Every African has got something, some plan, some business, something. I actually think that there's a lot of funding on this continent that could be harnessed in different ways. I think governments have to need to think about how they remove obstacles, how they can remove regulations, how they can actually foster growth from citizen groups. And in the end, really think carefully about how we move away from aid dependence, because it creates other pathologies. And without aid dependence, if African governments are standing on their own feet in terms of provision to their citizens, they can become stronger global players in terms of addressing some of the limitations that we see. And we're seeing that as well. You see Africa, AU joining into the G20, you see South Africa hosting G20, you see African governments working on the International Tax Treaty. We're beginning to see African governments playing a stronger role in creating a better world for all of us on some of these open society issues. And again, that's something we seek to support.
Yeah, so I really want to thank you for coming to give these lectures, because when Brian spoke to me last year, I don't think any of us imagined that he would give a lecture at a point where the world is having all these configurations. But more importantly for us as CAPSI, the opportunities that the current moment is presenting for us from a research perspective, but also from the possibilities of providing alternative ways in which development can take place. This moment really calls for a reimagination of different ways in which Africa should be financed and supported. And I think part of what your lecture did is really to focus everyone around that. And as I was saying before we started shooting, there's an ongoing debate after your lecture online about the importance of that particular moment And the fact that the panel that followed your lecture zeroed in on those conversations. Somebody sent me a text and said, after listening to that panel, she's of the view that the future of the continent, she's got hope. But the hope is that it's going to be women, girls, and young people who are going to take the continent forward. And I think you kind of mentioned that as well as we were talking just now.
Yeah. I don't want to downplay the challenges or the volatility of the world, but I have to say I'm a professional optimist. I actually think that there are always going to be people with that moral imagination, with that energy, and we're seeing it. And it's just coming in new places. And that's what we have to uncover it where it is and support it where we find it. Yeah. But I have no doubt that Africans will rise to the occasion and do what's needed. And I am very heartened by the fact that, for instance, South Africa is playing a role on the global stage with the ICJ case. I see South Africa hosting G20. These are all things that we should be celebrating.
Yeah, I always end by asking my guests to recount a story of philanthropy that might have shaped them or might have left an impression on them when growing up. You actually kind of alluded to some story about a group of people that supported you to go to study, but is there a particular story that left an impression on you as we were growing up, and it continues to influence your thinking as you work in this professional space as somebody who is leading a big philanthropic organization?
So I would say every African is a philanthropist.
Yeah.
Every African is supporting somebody with school fees. Every African, if someone is in hospital, people help for their hospital bills. If there's a funeral, people are helping. I mean, I grew up seeing that around me, that you always give when people need, and you give in the circle of people you know. It's not philanthropy in the sense of a big stone building with a name on the top with grants, but it is philanthropy. And so I saw it, and it goes all different ways. And I'll tell you a story. My father represented trade unionists in the 1980s, and they couldn't afford to pay. And he did the case for free. And many years later, like 20 years later, he came with a wad of cash, and it was all different bills. And I said, "What's this?" And he goes, "Oh, this group of trade unionists I'd represented 20 years ago who couldn't pay, they now have enough money, and they came and they paid me." And I feel like that's how the world goes around in Africa. And that's really my first experience of philanthropy.
Yeah. And finally, I want to take this opportunity. This is something that I want to tie it back to OSF. So way back in 2020, we had just gone into COVID, and I approached OSF to help us study the impact and the effect of COVID on businesses, on governments, but also on philanthropy, but also broadly on civil society, but also how philanthropy was also responding to COVID. And the result of that research is this book, the African philanthropic responses to COVID-19 and development in Africa. So I want to take this opportunity and present this copy to you. I've already signed it.
Oh, lovely. I'm so thrilled. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so let me saying I must open it.
To Binaifer Nowrojee, with appreciation for the visit and lecture at CAPSI. Thank you so much.
All right, Binaifer, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're very busy, but really I appreciate the opportunity to get some insights from you for our audience. I think it's not always possible for us to meet and have conversations with people who are busy, but I mean, I really don't take this for granted. So I wanted to take this opportunity and thank you for just the few minutes that you have spent with us. And of course, like I said, that book is now being used for research, but it's also used as a text for our students. And the interviews that we do with people like you also become available to our students for referencing, but also as part of guest lecturing. So thank you so much.
The honor is ours, and thanks for hosting us. It was great to be able to have that platform and just the hospitality and kindness for an amazing evening that I enjoyed, and I'm sure, and it sounds like the audience also enjoyed. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was Banaifer Nowrojee, the president of the Open Society Foundations, a seasoned grant maker and advocate for social justice, but as you heard, also has served in various positions within the Open Society Foundations. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.